1976. The United States and the Soviet Union's influence loomed over the world, the peace after the Cuban Missile Crisis straining as the nukes were pointed at one another. It was in this environment that Edward Luttwak, a defense analyst with no past nor training in ancient history, published The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire. Historians at first praised his work, saying it was one of the most important contributions to Roman history, and that Luttwak had done for Roman historians what they have not done for themselves. It would come to a surprise then that this newcomer's work, which was so initially praised, would become so influential yet flawed that it has since spawned an entire field of books and journals dedicated to criticizing it. Amongst the many quotes of thorough rejection from academics, my personal favorite is, "So conclusively wrong is this book that I do not think it should be included on any syllabus." So what did Luttwak argue that was so controversial? Before we even answer that question, however, we first need to define what grand strategy even is. To Luttwak, the grand strategy of a state was how it decided to allocate materials to achieve its goals. The goals for Rome, according to Luttwak, was to protect its citizens without harming its economic base or political order. The grand strategy itself manifested through what he called security systems. There were 3 of these security systems, each encompassing an era of Roman history. The first Luttwak identified was the early Principate, from the time the first emperor Augustus came into power to when the infamous Nero, the last of his dynasty, died 93 years later. This period is probably the most well-known in pop culture, as Augustus consolidates absolute power, him and his heirs presiding throughout absolute Roman domination. Luttwak attributes this to the empire having a good economy of force, a fancy term he uses which just means the ability to dedicate a minimal amount of force to efforts. He says this was possible because the Romans had an efficient balance of client states and direct administration. Only 25 legions, 28 before Arminius destroyed 3 in the Teutoburg Forest, alongside auxiliaries made up only around 300,000 men protecting the empire during Augustus. This surprisingly small number for an empire that ran from Spain to Syria, Luttwak argues, was possible as client states did the dirty work for Rome. He argues that Rome deliberately established these states, Noricum near the Danube, Cappadocia and Judea near the Parthians, and Mauritania against the Sahara, and many more to tanking invasions and repelling them, with Roman intervention only being required under dire circumstances. The actual legions could remain small in number, responding to threats only when needed. The next system, which Luttwak argues spans Rome's supposed golden age from 68 AD to 211 AD, began under Vespasian as he won the civil war that spawned after the suicide of Nero, to the death of Septimius Severus. This era was marked by unprecedented peace, as no enemy existed that could challenge Rome. Good emperors stewarded this period, famous names like Marcus Aurelius and Hadrian, which when paired with the earlier Principate has been known as the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. Such prolonged stability would not be seen in Europe until the 19th century under the British Empire's Pax Britannica. Nevertheless, Luttwak argues that this was possible because the empire consciously expanded out to its scientific frontiers, which included easily defendable terrain such as rivers or deserts. In areas where these didn't exist, they built fortifications such as Hadrian's Wall in Britain. By stationing legionaries along these natural, easy-to-defend borders, every threat was met head-on with Rome's forces. This system, given the fancy name of preclusive security, another piece of jargon that Luttwak just loves, kept the empire prosperous by repelling invasions when they happened, allowing no enemy troops within Rome's core territories. However, it was also incredibly expensive as the government had to maintain hundreds of thousands of troops at borders without significant reserve forces. Remember the 300,000 troops that ran the empire under Augustus? Under Septimius Severus, this number ballooned to around 500,000, which Luttwak uses as evidence for his theory. Regardless, Rome prospered. Famous architectural wonders such as the Pantheon and Colosseum were built. Art, literature, trade, all around the Mediterranean flourished under the stability of the empire that encompassed it. This famous painting by Thomas Cole may not explicitly depict this era, but it undoubtedly drew heavy inspiration from it. The marble-clad civilization that considered itself immortal. This system would fall apart during the 3rd century crisis, starting Rome's decline, when multiple concentrated threats appeared. Barbarian confederations would gather, outnumbering the Roman troops stationed at the borders. Breaking through this line, they would ravage the provinces. Without reserve forces, emperors would take troops from other frontiers to defeat them, leading to a chain reaction as those frontiers became weaker, allowing even more invasions. In response, Luttwak argues that a third system, lasting from the reign of Diocletian in 284 AD to around the middle of the 4th century. He dubbed it defense in depth, and it involved even more fortifications, not just at borders, but within the empire itself, to stall enemies. Barbarians would be baited into invasion, with the depleted frontier forces safely retreating into forts and cities. The barbarians found themselves trapped in Roman territory, food safely behind city walls. The emperor would then arrive with a mobile field army, hopefully defeating the barbarians and restoring order. Luttwak saw it as a rearward defense rather than a forward defense. Forward defenses, seen in earlier systems, involved armies actively defending or attacking enemies, while rearward defenses gave up land for time, sacrificing the prosperity in the outer provinces for flexibility towards multiple threats. At first glance, Luttwak's 3 systems seem airtight. They are logical, following the trends of expansion, then peace, then decline that we are so familiar with. But if we look closely, Luttwak's analysis is dependent on multiple dangerous assumptions. Cracks begin to show as we look at them, and the whole thing falls apart. See if you picked up on any of these as well. Firstly, he assumes that Roman legionary deployments at forts were made purely for defensive objectives, rather than other possibilities, like to enforce Roman rule upon unruly provinces. Secondly, he assumes that the Roman Empire's borders were established with the one goal of being used as a defense, or that generals and emperors who conquered up to it even thought about defense when making them. Next, he assumes that we can figure out the strategic systems and the thoughts and plannings of emperors such as defense in depth or preclusive security from purely archaeological remains. Yeah, more forts were built, but to come up with a detailed plan just from these remains is kind of a reach. Then he assumes that borders were fixed and identifiable throughout all 3 periods. Borders now are rigid lines in the ground separating states, but was this really the case more than 2,000 years ago? He also assumes Romans had a single system of defense identical across the locations of their vast empire, regardless if the terrain and location was different. Did emperors really use the same methods of defense in densely forested Gaul and flat and exposed Syria, the mountainous Balkans, and the dry, desolate Sahara? And finally, he assumes that strategic systems were constant across the periods. Did emperors and their successors really keep the same system in place for centuries at a time? Did it really not change with each one? Every single one of these assumptions has been shown by future studies to be incorrect. Let's examine each of the strategic systems one more time. During the early Principate, if you recall, the strategy of the Roman state according to Luttwak was a balance of client states surrounding the empire which tanked invasions, resulting in a good economy of force. And to a bird's eye observer, this can look to be very true. But examining each client state closer, we begin to see another trend. At every opportunity, we see that every emperor jumping at the chance to annex the states, rather than keep them around to maintain a good economy of force. When the king of Cappadocia died, Tiberius annexed it. Similarly, in Mauritania, Caligula had its king murdered and their kingdom annexed. It's clear that whenever given the opportunity, the Romans did not hesitate in annexation without concern. Even under Augustus, often attributed as the founder of this system, the empire aggressively annexed client states as seen in Judea and Noricum when given the opportunity. This really shouldn't be a surprise. Look at this passage in the Aeneid, for example. the author Virgil writes that Jupiter himself granted Rome an imperium sine fine, or an empire without bounds. The Aeneid was commissioned by Augustus and is commonly viewed as a propaganda tool meant to justify his power and explain his actions. Virgil describes how the gods prophesize that this empire will be ruled by a Caesar who will bound his empire with ocean, implying that Rome will rule the entire world. And who is this mysterious Caesar? It's Augustus. And if you still had doubts on whether this document was propaganda, the Aeneid then goes on to say how Augustus will be famed with the stars, and how under him, harsh times would ease and war would stop. Real subtle. Anyways, putting imperial expansion as a divine mandate and how you would rule the entire world doesn't seem like something that a person with an elaborate system of defense and borders in mind would do. Nevertheless, there are still some scenarios in which Luttwak's theory seems to hold. When Claudius invaded Britain, the friendly realm of the Brigantes was established as a client state. It's easy to see it acting as a buffer between Rome and the tribes of the north, and nicely fits the model that Luttwak argues for. But, on the other side of the empire, one of the longest surviving client states, Thrace, is awkwardly positioned in northern Greece. What exactly is Thrace serving as a buffer for? These inconsistencies of the Roman client system makes us wonder if there was ever a Roman strategy of choosing client states to create, or if they were just created out of opportunity instead. Let's go back to the Brigantes. According to Luttwak, the Romans should have purposely established the buffer state and kept it around to repel invasions and preserve Roman troops. So did this ever happen? Well, the Brigantes during its client state status was ruled by Queen Cartimandua and her husband. When Claudius invaded Britain, she received Roman protection after handing over Caradicus. Caradicus had led the British resistance against the Romans, so this was a pretty big deal. But here comes the fun part. Cartimandua reportedly grows wary of her husband and divorces him and marries a servant. This incredible scandal, which would have done numbers if it had happened today, is then followed with the angry nobles and her ex-husband starting a civil war against Cartimandua. Now, our only source for this is Tacitus, and just like everyone 2,000 years ago, he was unapologetically misogynist, and we can assume that the story of Cartimandua is probably false to some degree, to make her seem as foolish as possible. But no matter what the true story was, the divorce happened, and Rome had to send troops to keep Cartimandua in power. After a couple of years, however, we get accounts of her ex-husband staging another revolt, however, this time during the year of the 4 emperors, when Rome was preoccupied with civil war. He successfully takes over the state, ending its client state status, with Rome only being able to rescue Cartimandua, with this time being the last time we hear of her ever again. When the civil war ended, Rome then began the process of conquering the Brigantes, which from the scattered sources we have took decades but eventually succeeded, as the Romans conquered up to where Hadrian's Wall now stands today. So was the Brigantes client state established purposely and helped preserve Roman forces? Not at all. In fact, it needed Roman intervention to keep its queen Cartimandua in power, using Roman troops instead of saving them. Rome also doesn't seem to have established the state on purpose. Cartimandua was the one who took initiative, handing over Caradicus and making her tribe subservient to the Romans. It seems kind of impromptu, as the Romans just kind of accepted her offer, likely not having the ability to conquer that far north into Britain yet anyways. Cartimandua herself never gave a reason for the Romans to conquer her afterwards, and when she was deposed by her ex-husband, the Romans, once finishing up their civil war, promptly conquered the state. No strategic plans of buffers seems to have happened, and the existence of the Brigantes being a client state seems to be merely a process, as the Romans accepted states to be their clients when they couldn't conquer them, waited for a reason to invade, and then promptly did. This mirrors the process of the other client states, with Roman conquest happening as soon as an excuse arrived. The simple expansion of the empire seems to always have been the overarching strategy, not some fancy system of client states preserving Roman power as Luttwak believes. Next, we move on to Luttwak's second strategic system, the one of preclusive defense, where Rome conquered up to natural scientific borders and no more, building forts along them to ensure the safety and prosperity of the empire. This system has been bashed to death by academics in so many ways, but I'll try to summarize their arguments here. First is the idea of a natural defendable border in the first place. While now, blessed with satellite imagery, we may look at a map of Europe and identify spots where defense is theoretically easier, like rivers or desert, the Romans certainly did not. This is the map of the world described to us by the Romans. It is recreated from the writings of Strabo and Pliny, two esteemed intellectuals of Rome, and is, as I hope you've realized, a little incorrect. Firstly, the Romans believed the world to be an ellipse, assigning the continents of Asia and Africa as roughly the size of Europe. A side effect of this is that it severely shrinks what is today Eastern Europe, putting the massive expanse of land between France and Moscow to be the size of the Balkans. The borders we view as natural and defensible probably weren't viewed the same way in Roman times. Paired with the belief that the Caspian Sea may have not been landlocked, some historians argue that the Romans were trying to push to natural borders, with those borders being the ocean that was surely just a bit past the Rhine River. The expedition into Dacia, which would have been around here on this map, is also used as evidence for this failed push. In fact, one controversial quote from a historian is that the iconic borders of Rome we now know today may actually have been symbols of abdication and failure, shameful reminders that the Romans fell short of the divine task of conquering the entire world. During the early stages of Rome's empire, it took 3 whole decades after the Romans retreated from Germania when towers and roads began appearing, showing a real physical border, as if finally the Romans admitted that the German conquest may not be possible at the moment. The thought of going past the Rhine, however, seemed to have been always on the table, the temporary border merely that, temporary, standing between Rome and its destiny of world conquest. If you're still on the fence about this, let's go back to seeing how the Roman emperors described themselves during this period of supposedly stable natural borders. Lucius Verus was hailed as propagator imperii, or extender of the empire. Septimius Severus was remembered as this long epitaph, which boils down to restored the republic and extended the empire of the Romans. It seems that no matter the era, the Roman state still had one goal, and it wasn't security through defense, but glory through expansion. If we go into detail on how exactly the Romans expanded, we also get more hints that their imperialism was more makeshift than planned. When Caesar invaded Britain, he had no idea where he was going. He sent an officer ahead with a ship who returned after 5 days to scout the coast. 5 days. Caesar invaded Britain on 5 days worth of intelligence of a guy on a boat. Caesar was lucky that he survived, but Aulus Gallus was less so. He was told that Arabia was very rich and launched an invasion force from Egypt. Just like that, off a rumor. Gallus's invasion was a disaster as he wandered around in the desert for 2 whole years, having incorrect maps and being led astray by the locals, achieving nothing. On another note, another example of the Romans' lack for knowledge of geography is one of my favorite anecdotes from Tacitus, as he is recounting the advantages for invading Hibernia, or Ireland. He says that because it lies between Britain and Spain, it would help the Romans command the ocean between Gaul, Spain, and Britain. Which is, yeah. This misinformation came from Agricola, the man who campaigned and conquered most of northern Britain, who likely knew more about Ireland than any other Roman. The harshest takeaway that I've seen on Luttwak's original claim on Romans conquering 4 defensible borders is from Benjamin Isaac, that the Romans conquered almost purely out of desire for glory and profit, with no other care in the world. So, was there ever a period of preclusive defense, where the empire worked to be safe within secured borders? Well, actually, kind of yes. The rule of Hadrian saw something resembling Luttwak's model. Hadrian famously gave up Trajan's conquests in Mesopotamia and began building fortifications, most famously Hadrian's Wall, protecting Britain, and the Limes Germanicus, protecting Gaul. But looking closer at these fortifications reveals that they aren't as organized and straightforward for defense as they might seem. In the West, the idea of the Limes Germanicus as a wall of fortifications is very questionable. The word limes is often translated today to mean simply frontier, but in Roman times it was used to refer to a lot of things, from, yes, forts, but also to rudimentary tracts cut in forests to help legions. Anything related to the military infrastructure was called a limes. The fancy name of Limes Germanicus was not an impenetrable wall of forts, but likely just a loose border, with Roman forts and military activities scattered about it. No narrative proof supports that the Limes Germanicus was some impenetrable boundary of forts to stop barbarians either. Moving on to Hadrian's Wall, which funnily enough was never even called a limes, was also likely not built to be an impenetrable wall to stop barbarians. Perhaps it's from scenes like the giant ice wall in Game of Thrones, which was inspired by Hadrian's Wall, which gives many people the impression of a big fortification separating civilization from barbarity. In reality, Hadrian's Wall was only about 3.7 meters tall, which is like the height of 2 refrigerators on top of each other. Definitely not small, but gives some barbarians a ladder and it may as well just be a speed bump. It also had multiple frequent gateways, leading historians to now think that it was meant to control and monitor movement rather than a wall defending against the White Walkers, or even worse, the Scots of the north. But let's give Luttwak the benefit of the doubt. Even if we do believe Hadrian had a grand strategy, he was terrible at passing it down. Antonius Pius, his successor, expanded on the Limes Germanicus and abandoned Hadrian's Wall in favor of the Antonine Wall, taking a much more aggressive stance. Hadrian's peace with the East turns out to be an exception rather than a rule, as both Marcus Aurelius and Septimius Severus sacked the Parthian capital. Dura Europus, a city far deep into Mesopotamia, beyond any natural frontiers, was garrisoned until the late 250s, beyond Luttwak's period of pre-inclusive security. If Hadrian truly had a system of defense and forts in mind, then it should have just been that. A Hadrianic system, not a Roman system that Luttwak assigns to 2 centuries worth of rulers with different personalities and circumstance. Luttwak's third example is probably his most egregious. After the 3rd century crisis, the empire, he claims, developed defense in depth. As a reminder, the strategy involves fortifying internally rather than fortifying borders, allowing enemies into the empire to be fought later by a central field army. Archaeologically, this should be pretty easy to verify, as we just need to check for an increase of forts being built internally. So here's a map of Roman forts along the Danube before the 3rd century crisis. And now here are the forts built during or after it. Notice anything different in the placement? Well, you shouldn't, because they are practically the same. Some forts are even built beyond the Danube, funnily enough supporting forward defense rather than rearward defense. On another corner of the empire in Arabia, a number of forts can be seen scattered across it, seemingly supporting defense in depth. But the dating of these forts go back to the time of the previous system, and most were actually built as a defense against internal rebels and brigands rather than an external threat. So what else? Luttwak also points to Britain, where legionary camps stationed between Hadrian's Wall, such as Diva and Eboracum, show defense in depth. But, once again, these forts existed since the previous system, with Diva and Eboracum having troops mainly to defend against seaborne attacks. Reading Luttwak, it's actually quite funny, as you get this feeling that he himself knew that his theory was grasping at straws. He once describes Diocletian's policies as shallow defense in depth, which is just, what? He also admits that Diocletian implemented policies that resemble the forward defense of previous systems, and that multiple emperors after Diocletian also implemented policies resembling it. Furthermore, which I find quite funny, is that there is actually a lot of evidence that could be used to support the first two systems within the time period of the third one. For example, the Devil's Dykes, deep above the Danube, and the Brazda Louis Novak, also deep within barbarian territory, to support allied tribes shows forward defense much more than rearward defense. Even literary evidence contradicts Luttwak's conclusion. On the Emperor Valens, Ammianus Marcellinus writes, "He made a bridge of boats to cross the river at Noviodunum, and forced his way into barbarian territory. And after continuous marches, he attacked the warlike people of the Gruthungi, who lived very far off." Now, I don't know about you, but the act of invading a faraway barbarian tribe to ensure safety of the empire sounds a lot like a forward campaign. After looking at these examples, we might come to the conclusion that grand strategy just didn't exist at all. That the Roman Empire was less a chessboard of deliberate planning and more a frantic game of whack-a-mole played with blood and legions. But to say that there was no grand strategy at all is just as misleading as saying that there was one. What we are left with instead is neither a micromanaged plan of defense or an impromptu lackadaisical one. Rather, we get something in the middle, a shifting world of strategic behaviors, reactions, and improvisations, and thanks to the concentration of power at the top, shaped by the whims, egos, and emergencies of the emperors in power. Kimberly Kagan, in her amazing paper, Redefining Roman Strategy, argues that while Luttwak's systems failed to capture just how complex the Roman world was, there still was a grand strategic logic to how emperors deployed troops or allocated resources. The Romans did practice grand strategy, they just didn't structure it or write it down in explainable terms, and certainly not in the clean phrases Luttwak liked to imagine. So do we dismiss Luttwak? Write him off as another flawed historian whose work was done in vain? Well, not exactly. His work is evidently incorrect, but it doesn't mean that it was worthless. His book created the questions that helped redefine this field. Remember the beginning, the entire field of books and journals that spawned to criticize Luttwak. This plethora of research and knowledge would have never happened had Luttwak not blundered about, attempting to put his modern military lens onto empires 2 millennia in the past. So, was this blundering worth it? Absolutely. Just look at psychology's Sigmund Freud, whose pseudoscientific ideas, backed by little evidence, led people rushing to critique his works. These critiques, books, journals, papers, building off of the remains of Freud's ideas of the mind having hidden motivations, shaped the foundation of modern psychology. To Charles Lyell, a creationist, in other words believing that the world, its people, and its animals came from divine creation. You might have not heard of him, but you sure have heard of Charles Darwin, who, unsatisfied with Lyell's explanation on the origin and extinction of species, rejected his work and devised his own, the theory of evolution. The backbone of knowledge is built off disprovement. Bold claims and questions to be criticized and rebuked to the ground, yet inadvertently giving rise to fields or study that allow us to comprehend the world ever more slightly. You remember the quote that rebuked Luttwak in the beginning, that Luttwak's work was so conclusively wrong that it should not be included on any syllabus. Well, I haven't been completely honest on this source. The quote said by Tanner Greer is nestled within his article titled Science Proceeds One Question at a Time. Let's see what he says next. Since Luttwak published that book in 1976, a dozen studies of Roman frontier development, Roman strategic culture, and Roman decision-making have been published. All offer a steady refutation of Luttwak's work. However, not one of those books or articles would have been written without Luttwak's work. Luttwak was wrong in every particular except the questions he asked, but those questions were good enough to create an entire subfield of research. May all our errors do such good.